Dear students, welcome to the lecture of Public Sector Economics. In our today's lecture, we will discuss the public debt. We will define the public debt and the causes of public debt. We will discuss the history and much more about the public debt. So, the topics which we are going to discuss in today's lecture are public debt definition, history and types. Similarly, why the countries take public debt and trends and causes of public debt in the developing countries and the public debt of Pakistan. So our first topic is the evolution of public debt. It's an interesting topic. The history of public debt is very old. In ancient and medieval governments also had function more or less similar to modern states and needed functions. We know that when the expenditures of the government exceeds its revenue, then in order to finance the expenditure, the government needs some money which it creates through the public debt. The sources of revenue in the old states were very limited and they needed public debt but not publicly as today. Indian loans were in commodities instead of money and far short term for wars and personal and other purposes. The world history shows that most of the public debt in the old times were taken for the purpose of financing the wars. And it existed in the old India, in the Egypt, in Italy, in the Europe, and almost in all old states. In England, in 17th century, after the Britain Glorious Revolution, which of 1688, the princes, landlords, and clerics owned states generated their income through the payments by farmers, etc., for military protection. Similarly, some researchers links back the history of public debt back to the 4th century. The origin of modern public debt originated from the Britain Glorious Revolution and American Revolution in 1776. As I discussed in the beginning of the lecture that in Italy its origin goes back to 1861 Act from Gran Labro and Great Book of Public Debt. Means the public debt existed in old Italia. Italian government took it for financing wars and establishment of kingdom after unification, adjusting all old loans. Italian bankers lent Edward III during the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1443, but it was short-term and with high interest rates. This means the history of the public debt is very old in Italy. The long-term loan started in 1500 AD. Dinsico 2011-2015 pointed out largest states had fiscal machinery and had extended functions. That is the reason that they needed more funds to finance their functions. According to Ismaglu, the war finance objective then shifted to the provision of public goods. As discussed in the previous slides, the basic aim initially, the logic behind, the cause behind the public debt was to create funds to finance the wars. But with the passage of time, we see that the functions of the government changed, the functions of the government increased, and with increase in the government functions, the government needed more and more funds to finance their expenditure, which led to increase in the public goods. which led to increase in the public debt. In the 18th and 19th century, the functions of government were limited due to laissez-faire philosophy. We know about the classical theory that the government has no role in the economy, but after the 18th and 19th century, this concept changed. The public borrowing policies took turning point after the World War I and the Great Depression of 1930s. We know that after the World War I and the Great Depression, the laissez-faire economy concept of the laissez-faire economy was completely failed, and which led to the in simple word, in other words, you have read about the classical theory of income and employment, which aimed at the assumption of the full level of employment in the economy, and which stated that which is based on the perfect competition and the full level of employment and the laissez-faire economy. But it failed completely in 1930s, after the 1930s Great Depression, and which led to the establishment of a new theory developed by James Keynes, which suggested public borrowing as a war financing to England. In the 1930s, the Great Depression led to the government intervention, and as discussed, the Keynesian theory also suggests the intervention of the government necessary. The role of the government increased in the economy, and balanced budgets deteriorated when public expenditure exceeded public revenues. We know that, as discussed in the beginning of the lecture, that the concept of the public debt was developed when the public expenditure exceeded the public revenues. Because the government had no fund to finance the public expenditure, so one of the way to finance the public expenditure was borrowing from the banks, borrowing from the public, from the landlords, and from the other sources to finance the expenditure. So after the increase in the function of the government started borrowing from public, banks, and foreign resources. The case became more severe for the developing countries. Weak economic conditions, increase in the functions of states, wars, emergencies led the developing countries to borrow more and more. All this generated the concept of the public debt. Now, let us define the public debt. Public debt or national debt or sovereign debt is a debt owned by the public sector, that is by governments and their agencies. In other words, according to the Webster Dictionary, public debt is the total of the nation's debt of the local, state, and national governments, and an indicator of how much public spending is financed by borrowing instead of taxation. In simple words, the public debt means the amount borrowed by government to finance its expenditure. We have different types of the public debt. The first type is the productive and unproductive debt. As it's clear from the title of the title that productive and unproductive. A public debt is said to be productive if it is used for the productive purposes. It is used for developmental purpose, and it is expected that it may yield some revenue in future. For example, the construction of a railway system, metros, dams. A very good example of the productive debt is motorways in Pakistan. We know that the motorway system, which was initiated by the ex-Prime Minister Mia Mohammad Nawaz Sharif, and the first motorway, which was built in M2 from Islamabad to Lahore, uh, which was also a productive debt, and later on the we see network of motorways in Pakistan. Similarly, irrigation projects can be also productive because it will lead to increase in the production, agricultural production. Uh, the In case of the productive debt, the revenue self-finance it's the repayment of the debt. Similarly, along with the productive, as the clear from the title, the unproductive loans are those type of the debt which is taken for the other purposes than the production. For example, for the defense, for floods, for famine, for social services, etc. If a loan is taken for such these one of these purposes, then it is expected that it will not create any revenue, or no revenue is expected from the loan. Such type of the debt is called unproductive. So it should be clear that the productive debt is that debt which creates some revenue in future, and which is used for productive purposes, for the some projects, for the developmental budget, as a developmental budget, for the development purposes. It is productive, while non-productive is that one which is used for the emergencies or for the defense, etc., and no revenue is expected from it. Voluntary and forced debt. The voluntary loan is voluntary debt is given by public, by the bodies voluntarily, and government. For example, government issues bonds against which it pays interest. The government tries to attract public for it through the different ways, and the public purchases such type of the bond in order to earn some interest. Such type of a debt is known as the voluntary debt, because it is not forced by the government, but the people purchase these bonds according to their own will. Similarly, the forced debt is taken forcibly, usually in case of severe emergencies or wars, and such type of the loans, such type of the debt is not the given voluntarily. Similarly, another much discussed topic in the economics is the internal and external debt. It is clear that internal debt is that debt which is taken from the internal sources, while domestic sources, and external debt is that debt which is taken from the external sources or from foreign sources. So the government use both the internal and external sources of debt. If the government borrows from public or the commercial banks within a country, or from the central bank of the country, it will be internal debt. For example, in case of the Pakistan takes loans from the State Bank of Pakistan, from the commercial banks, MCB, UBL, etc. Then such type of a debt is called internal debt. Similarly, it also takes debt from the public in the form of the bonds, in the form of the certificates, saving certificates, or some other many other types of the certificates. Similarly, if a loan is taken from outside sources, it will be external debt. Pakistani government borrow in form of national saving schemes, bonds, etc., and banks within a country, and the internal debt is preferred as the interest remains within the boundaries of the state. While from abroad, Pakistan has taken loan. Pakistan takes loan from the foreign countries, from the international financial institutions, and from the bodies as international bodies as well. Pakistan takes loans from IMF, from the World Bank, Such type of loans are external debt. Recently, Pakistan has repaid an uh, installment of the debt to the Saudi Arabia, but it took a similar debt from the China in order to pay to Saudi Arabia. Such type of a debt is called the external debt. Similarly, we have the short-term and short-term loans, medium-term loans, and the long-term loans. We know that the short-term debt stands from 3 to 9 months. The medium-term loan is from up to 5 years, and the long-term for the period more than 5 years. Similarly, we have another type of the public debt as redeemable and redeemable debt. Redeemable debt is the debt which the government is bound to pay after maturity period. The government makes plan in advance to pay, and most of the debts are redeemable. Irredeemable debt is that one whose interest is paid regularly, and the principal amount may be paid, but no fixed period. There is no fixed period for it. Similarly, the funded debt and unfunded debt is another type of the public debt. Funded debt is repaid after a long period of time, and government sets up a separate fund for it, a separate head for it. It is also called floating debt or long-term debt. The purpose of such type of a debt is building up an industrial and economic infrastructure, long-term projects which may generate revenue in future. Such type of a debt is called a funded debt, for which is discussed. A fund is generated, a separate head is for it is generated so that it may be paid in future, and such type of a debt is usually for long period of time. Unfunded debt, no fund is created for its payment, and government repay it in as a routine expenditure. Unfunded is usually a short-term loan. We have another important topic here. A question arises in mind: what are the causes of the public debt? Why the countries take public debt? So we will discuss step by step. One of the reasons for the increase in the public debt is the abandonment of the laissez-faire economy, because as discussed previously, after the World War One and the Great Depression, it was recommended that the government should intervene in the economy in order to regularize the system, in order to regularize the economy. So after the intervention of the state in the economy, the expenditure of the states increased, and in order to finance the increased expenditure, the government started taking public debt. So one of the reason behind it is that one. Unpopularity of taxes. We know that in the developing countries and in the backward countries, the tax system is not popular one. So due to the unpopularity of the taxes, the revenue of the governments are low, and they are not able to finance their expenditure. If you look at the economy of Pakistan, we have not a regular economy. In our economy, we have the tax system not a very good one. There are lapses in the tax system, and we see that beside the indirect taxes, means the taxes which are levied on the goods, there is a big proportion of the population which is not paying tax. Means the taxes are not very popular in our economy. The Besides a few uh, indirect taxes and direct taxes, and we see that there is uh, tax evasion on a large scale. Similarly, another reason for the growing public debt in the developing country is the natural calamities. Natural calamities are natural in both in the developed and developing countries. Not only the developing countries are prey of the natural calamities, but also developed countries. But in the developing countries, the states are not able to finance the expenditure in case of natural calamities. So, one of the way to finance the expenditures which increase due to the natural calamities is to take loans. The biggest reason of the public debt in the developing countries is the defense and war expenditure. The defense expenditure in the developing countries is rising due to uh, huge, due to large number of disputes within the countries and cross borders. For example, if we look at the economy of Pakistan, we are not safe from any side. We have disturbance on our western border with Afghanistan and with eastern border with the India. Similarly, the border with the Iran is also not very safe. So, in order to protect our boundaries, in order to protect our borders, uh, we need more and more expenditure. We need more and more funds to finance our defense system. Similarly, we have regular disturbance on our eastern border with India. So, in order to finance that, we need more and more funds. And in the history, we see wars with India 1948, 1971, 1965. So, in all those wars, we needed funds in order to finance our military. So, similarly, is the case of the India or the African countries. They need more and more funds, even for the big countries, for the countries like Saudi Arabia. Uh, they need more and more fund in order to finance their defense. So it is another reason of the increase in the public debt, reason for the growing public debt. Budget deficit are very common in the developing countries, even in the developed countries. We discussed in the lecture public budget and the deficit in budget, that even a country like America face a budget deficit. But the developing countries find it difficult to finance the budget deficit. For example, in Pakistan, we see that a regular deficit and a growing deficit in the budget, fiscal deficit. So, in order to finance that deficit, Pakistan uses mostly the public debt as an option for the financing the budget deficit, which is adding to increase in the public debt. We will discuss in the coming slide the public debt of Pakistan. So, one of the reasons for the huge public debt is the debt taken for financing the budget deficit. Similarly, most of the countries, they are, especially developing countries, they are fighting the depression, and they need more fund in order to finance their expenditure. Similarly, in order to for the economic development, they are developing the infrastructure. They are taking the other measures too. So they need more and more funds. Another subtopic of the today's lecture is trend in public debt in Pakistan. So we start from Pakistan. In Pakistan, we are facing fiscal deficits, and our debt level is increasing day by day. As discussed in the previous slide, that one of the options which is very often used in Pakistan to finance the fiscal deficit is the public debt. We see often a shortfall in foreign exchange reserves, and which lead to increase in the public debt. Similarly, one of the reasons for the increase in the public debt is the devaluation of Pakistan rupee. In recent years, we see that the Pakistan rupee was devaluated against the US dollar to a great extent, which increased the public debt of Pakistan. And similarly, we often see that we collect taxes less than our target, or we do not have the estimated revenue, which lead to the public budget deficit, and we need fund to finance the public fiscal deficit. The total public debt stood at 35,207 billion at the end of March 2020. This was a very big and alarming figure, that the public debt of Pakistan stood 35,207 billion by end of March 2020, against the figure of 32,700 billion at the end of June 2019. Means that during the period of 8 months, Pakistan took almost 3,000 billion to 3,000 billion rupees loan, and one of the reason was to support the balance of payment and build up of foreign exchange reserves. This chart shows the public debt of Pakistan, the trend in the public debt of the Pakistan. This is not in the developing countries, but we can say that it is public debt in Pakistan. The chart is very clear cut, and it is one of the I can say that one of the easiest way to show the trend of public debt in Pakistan. Right back in 1971, the total public debt of Pakistan was 30 billion in rupees, 30 billion rupees, which increased to 55 billion very next year, then to 60 billion, and so on. And we see not a very rapid but a slow and steady increase in the public debt till we can say 1996 it was 920 billion, and a slow increase 2004 2028 billion. In 2005 it was 2178 billion, total 4,000, and the 4,211 billion, and right in 2011 it was 10,771 billion. And we see that Till 2016, it was 1921, and a very sharp rise we see from 2017 to 2020. The public debt in these years is alarming one. From in 2017, it was 21,409 billion, which increased to, and there was an increase of 3,000 billion rupees in 2018, and from 2019 to 18 to 19, in 1 year, Pakistan took record loans, and here we see that more than 8,000 billion rupees, a very big loan, a very big jump here. Further, we see that another jump was from 19, another jump from 2019 to March. This was June 2019 to March 2020. It was a very big loan, a big increase of 3,000 billion, and the public debt of Pakistan stood at 35,207 billion right at the end of March 2020. Similarly, the global debt was, so far the other countries are concerned, the global debt reached an all-time high of $184 billion in the non-nominal terms, the equivalent of 225% of GDP in 2017. The most indebted economies in the world are also richer ones. The United States, China, Japan account for more than half of the global debt. These are the richest countries. The United States, China, and Japanese economy, they took more than half of the global debt. The private sector debt has tripled since 1950, and emerging market economies continue to borrow, but at a slower rate. China debt declined in 2017. It is a very good picture of the public debt, global public debt, an increase from 2010 to 2018. We see a sharp rise till 2013, and then a fall in 2015-16, and then a sharpened rise beyond 2016. Among the developing countries, the Taiwan has the seventh largest economy of Asia, and it is the 22nd economy in the world. It transformed into the capital developed economy, about 8% growth rate in the recent decades. Agriculture contributes 3% to the GDP against 35% in 1952. This is very good picture of the Taiwan economy, that it is as discussed earlier, capital developed economy. It has about 8% of the growth rate in the recent decades. The GDP of the agriculture contributes to 3% of GDP against 35% in 1952, which means a complete transformation from agriculture to the industrial economy. The service sector makes up 73% of the economy, and here in the Taiwan, the public debt as a percentage of GDP is 36. Nominal GDP is $573 billion. Brazil is another developing economy. The fiscal situation worsened in 2008 due to two reasons. First, due to the tax exemptions granted by the federal government, reducing public revenue. Secondly, public spending continued to grow faster between 2008 and 2010. The public debt in the Brazil as a percentage of GDP is 153, or we can say the public debt is 153% of the GDP. The normal GDP is 2055 USD. Indonesia, one of the largest economies of South Asia, The crisis in the Indonesia started in 1990s, and the reasons behind the crisis were political and economic, which struck the Indonesian economy. The public debt in the public debt in Brazil in the Indonesia is 69% of the GDP. This is a picture of the public debt in Indonesia. Iran is another developing economy of the world, and much contributions to the world economy. The mismanagement, populist policies, corruption, and sanctions, U.S. sanctions which came into effect in mid 2018, had led to a huge government debt to banks in Iran. Oil and gas, major sectors which dominated the economy, uh, and uh, uh, the public debt in the Iran is 40% of the GDP, while the normal GDP is 431 billion USD. Saudi Arabia is another developing countries which is Middle East economy, less of the nationals to the economic opportunities, subsidies, free public goods, inconsistent economic policies, conflicts, oil crisis led the government to borrow. Prince Mohammed bin Sultan is leading the country, and he continues to have a strong popularity in Saudi Arabia, and is providing a strong signal to the investors. Public debt in the Saudi Arabia is 80% of the GDP, and the normal GDP is 687 billion US dollars. Similarly, the India, which has 521 billion USD economy, is also a developing countries, and it is one of the countries which has taken huge public debt. Dear student, it was our today's lecture. The material in this for this lecture has been taken from these sources, so you are advised to go through these sources in order to get a complete picture of the public debt and trend in the public debt, history of the public debt, and the these slides will be uploaded on the LMS soon. Thank you very much.